The World Energy Council is a non-governmental organization that is accredited by the United Nations. It has been founded in 1923 with the aim of promoting sustainable and affordable energy for the greater benefit of all. One of my roles at the World Energy Council is to promote our work on the Global Energy Scenarios 2050. When I started to work for the World Energy Council, the project had already been in place for almost 2 years. We are now nearing the end of this extremely challenging and interesting piece of work. After the Montreal 2010 World Energy Congress, the World Energy Council realized that it was important to develop its own energy scenarios. So we formed a group of experts, and in a very open, transparent and inclusive process, we have ever since worked on our scenarios. Now, how did we do that? First of all, we tried to identify the key drivers that might have an impact on the energy landscape in 2050. We then narrowed it down, and through very detailed and in-depth analyses, we were able to identify 15 clusters. Out of these 15 clusters, an example of such clusters could be the role of governments, the economic development, CO2 mitigation, the development in India and China, skills, labor, energy demand, etc. We then developed 2 stories. And scenarios building is very much about developing the right stories. So the stories we want to tell is how the energy landscape might look like in 2050. For the moment being, we have called our scenarios the jazz and symphony scenario. What we wanted to do is we wanted to give the scenarios a name that tells a little bit the story, but at the same time allows us to describe the complexity of the energy landscape in 2050. So as you can imagine, jazz is a style of music that is very freestyle, it's very open. You might have a small group of people, of musicians playing music together. Whereas in symphony, things are a little bit more orchestrated. There might be a conductor in place who has to coordinate activities of up to 60 musicians in an orchestra. So what does that mean in scenario terms? In jazz, we assume that basically there is an open and free market where energy supply is met by a wide range of technologies. The government does not play such an important role in here, and most importantly, we do not assume that there will be consolidated agreement on climate change issues. Things are a little bit different in the symphony scenario. Here we have governments playing a more dominant role, we have an agreement on climate change, and we assume that the government also plays technology winners through subsidies and regulation. So these 2 stories then allow us to quantify actually energy supply and demand up to 2050, and we are using a global multi-regional market allocation model with that. Out of this model, we can derive key figures in terms of evidence policy making that allow us then to describe energy supply up to 2050. Now, in this model, we also have some statements about CCS and the role of CO2. And I'm happy to say that in the Jazz Symphony, CO2 emissions are slightly higher, in line with higher GDP growth and higher demand for electricity. They are slightly less in the symphony scenario because we have less economic growth, slightly lower GDP, and a higher emphasis on, first of all, energy efficiency, then carbon mitigation, of course, and international climate agreements. CCS plays a very important role, and in scenario building terms, it is what we call a critical uncertainty. So obviously we have slightly less CCS in the jazz scenario than we have in the symphony scenario. This is due to the fact that we have less emphasis on climate change probably in the jazz scenario, and also due to the fact that there might not be a top-down agreement on climate change in the jazz scenario. CCS as a technology plays a very important role. In the short term, which is up to 2030, however, we cannot see a worldwide penetration of this technology. And this is basically due to 2 reasons. First of all, right now, the investment costs are relatively high. And secondly, there might be public resistance due to the NIMBY issue, the not in my backyard issue. However, we do feel that from 2030 onwards up to 2050, CCS could play a more prominent role, especially in the US, in Canada, and probably also China. Now, China is a very interesting topic because we have spoken to senior politicians and leaders in the energy field there, and the message we got is that the Chinese quite clearly expressed that they would not want to be the technology leader in order for the Western world to capture the gains from developing their technology. At the same time, though, they are aware of the increasing climate issue, and they have realized that there's a need to reduce CO2 emissions.